So, there's a lot of things to consider when you're looking at a new employer. And one of the biggest ones to consider is your work-life balance is put up by this little graph here, where the standards expected and what kind of pay are we going to be making at this place. Pay is very, very important because that tells you how much you have to work versus how much you want to work. First and most importantly, though, let's talk about work-life happiness. No one likes to live at work. No one has, no one ever will. With that being said, work is something we have to do a lot of in any industry. Hard work gets you ahead in America. But a lot of places overdo it. Signer EMS, for one, out in western Oklahoma, 524s a week. That puts them somewhere roughly in this area of perpetual happiness. And it shows in their turnover numbers. And even though their employees might make 40 or 50K a year, they're working literally 80 to 90% of their lives at work in uniform, working for other people's money. So, not exactly an optimal work-life balance. In general terms, anything outside of about 72 hours a week is unsustainable for even a few months. A very few dedicated souls can go more than that, but that's not a happy zone. That's burnout in a can. So 72 hours a week is about the absolute maximum, and even that's pretty stretching it. Functionally, for pay to be commensurate with what people need to survive, they need to make at least $12 an hour, assuming they work a 72. If they back it down to 48, they need to be up at about 16-ish or so to have a lifestyle that actually is acceptable to the vast majority of people in this industry. Now, we also need to look over at standards. Pay and standards have a huge correlation with each other. This graph's a little simplistic, and it's a little hard to graph because no one wants to actually come out and admit that the standards are low because pay is low. But functionally, you can evaluate the standards a place gives you by the pay they quote you, and vice versa. If their standards are high, their pay is probably a little bit better, but not always. There are some huge exceptions, i.e. Pecos, Texas. So the more you're paid, the more expectations are had of you. That's true in any industry. A doctor makes more than a tech. A master mechanic makes more than an apprentice mechanic. An airliner pilot makes more than a Cessna crop duster. But the question of how much effort and at what point does the pay start catching up to the responsibility is a huge one. In EMS, the ground level is literally zero volunteers. That's not to say there's not standards held to them, but there's no effective enforcement mechanism. There's really nothing you can do aside from taking away from volunteering. So the standards are very lenient in those terms. Now, standards tend to rise faster than pay does because no one wants to come out and admit that they do a bad job for more money, and that's how the world works. Standards go faster than pay. But as standards rise, pay does rise. However, it's a slow rise at first because the standards are still fairly low. Now, once your pay starts coming up into the more livable ranges, the standards have improved measurably. And that's where we start seeing our first big things, our first big breaks. Once you hit the flight level or a certain level of experience, let's say 5 or 10 year paramedic, at that point your pay is approximately commensurate with the standards in your education. Before that, you're actually probably being paid a little more than the standards themselves would have implied. And after that, you'll be paid far more than the standards, but you'll have exceeded the standards of most of the industry, so that's good. So what you really want to do is find a place that keeps you on a path to reach this level here and continue up to happiness, as opposed to falling off and going into some other industry. Now that happens a lot because the pay often does not stay commensurate with the responsibilities. As standards increase, the pay often just stays the same and people get burned out. That's why we lose a lot of people to other professions. Now, this all wraps up here in this massive graph here. This is essentially what a brand new EMT can expect to make in this field. Starting around 20K for part-time work, assuming they do it all year, and really dependent on the hours they work per week to bring it up. You can hypothetically be an EMT working 136 hours a week and make 40 to 50K a year. It is completely doable and done by very many people. However, as we discussed in this portion, that's not very sustainable. So let's say you start out as a part-time EMT. You're starting out, call it $10 an hour. That's pretty average for Oklahoma. Maybe a little less if you're in a rural area. If you only work 20 to 40 hours a week, you're still going to come in way south of 40K a year. At about $10 an hour, you'll be somewhere in this area at best. Now, if you become a full-time EMT, working 48 to 72 hours a week, or 48 to 60 hours a week, you're going to end up making about 25K in most places in the state. Your overtime pay will be substantial, and you'll bring home a lot of extra money. However, there's a very stringent cap in that it's rare you'll get outside these without having to exceed that 60 to 72 hour mark. To get really above that as an EMT, you have to really surge out this way, more towards the living at work concept again. And once again, that brings us to our unfriendly man there. So, functionally in this industry, to make more than about $25,000 to $27,000 a year, you have to be a paramedic in order to have that and a family life. Now, we have actually paramedic divided into two separate categories because there's two very different categories of pay in terms of organizations. Rural paramedics are great people, but by golly, those private services out there and a lot of the government services treat them they take them for granted. It's extremely poor treatment. The problem that a lot of these guys have is that they're very connected to the area they live in, and that means they don't want to leave. So they keep coming back and hoping it gets better and trying to fight these good fights. But in a lot of places, the population just doesn't want to support you. So if you're in a rural area, i.e. Woodward, Oklahoma, you might be working 60 to 80 hours a week out here, but you'll only be making $14 an hour. And out of that hours, you'll only be paid for 16 out of every 24. So if you're only making $220 a shift and you're working 4 or 5 days a week, you're still making some money, but you're only going to end up about here in the pay scale. Once again, referring back to our standards versus happiness, your standards over here are extremely high, but your pay is very low, and you're on the slope to burnout. That's a bad place to be. Now, that's not the rule of all rural services, but it is a fairly standard rule in terms of what they can afford to pay. Unfortunately, the most advanced services on the planet, Presidio, Texas, only pays its people about $37,000 a year for medics at max, and that is for a shift that lasts 7 days. That is 168 hours for $37,000 a year. For those of us, and that's before taxes. For those of us who do a little division, that is about $3,000 a month. That's a heck of a lot of hours to only make $3,000 a month. So, rural paramedic is this very, very hard to work in, hard to pin down group. Great rewarding work, spiritually very excellent, but the pay just isn't there in a lot of cases. And I hate to say it, but that's something I have to bring to the attention of every EMS student that comes through and wants to be a paramedic. It's something that you have to really love if you want to work in the rural areas. But it's not all doom and gloom. Once you get into a community that supports you more, or into a city, you can actually start making some real money pretty fast, and you can really make it kind of a lower amount of hours. Now, obviously, the more hours you work, the more hours the more you'll get paid. But for a urban paramedic, you often start out higher, and you get shifted up farther. Most urban paramedics work a minimum of 36 hours a week, with 48 being the average and 60 being pretty darn common. 72 in an urban area, it tends to burn people out so quickly that it's not even tried in a lot of places. It can be done with overtime, but it's very rare that people will sustain that for more than a few months. Once again, we go back to our work-life balance here, where the more you work, the less happy you are. 72 hours is the cutoff in a lot of places. And in an urban setting, it's more like 60 hours, because this is five days of the week you're working. This is 6 days a week you're working if you're working 12-hour shifts, and that gets depressing fast. So we're back in our urban setting. 35K is a pretty reasonable floor for brand new paramedics in an urban system working only the base pay of 412s a week. At EMSA, for instance, you'd be starting at about $14.12 an hour. That was the base pay when I left AMR. Not fantastic, but it translates to right at about 35 to 36K-ish after taxes. So you're already, just by virtue of moving to the city, making about 5 or 6K more than your rural counterparts for the same job. Once again, now we're still on the scale and your responsibility is still low, but at least you're a little higher. Now you're kind of coming up towards that direction. Now, the other thing about medic in an environment where the community supports you more is that the pay is a lot more closer to a full professional level. This means that we can actually soar up a lot higher faster with minimal extra hours worked, if any. Sometimes it's even a vertical jump or near vertical in what we can actually accomplish. What this means is that now, instead of having to work on that happiness balance, now we're finally starting to remain commensurate with our skills. We're starting to fly up this way. The further you get in this field as a paramedic, the more education you have and the higher you get, you can start trending up almost vertically towards flight and other fields that take you higher than about 49 to 50K a year. These are jobs that are harder to get, but still very achievable. However, they're almost unachievable if you lock yourself in only one place, and they're completely unachievable if you lock yourself as an EMT for years and years and years. It's simply financially impossible to get ahead in this without advancing yourself to some extent. It can be done, you can raise a family, but it's going to be a long, hard slog, and you're going to have to work very, very hard to do it in an environment that does not condone working very hard for it. So that's something to be very aware of.